Well, thanks for joining us in week 2 of our little adult ed class here. Once again, if you're new to this, we are taking this as an opportunity to look at some of the supporting theology behind this week's message, August 2nd. And so Ryan preached this week in a little bit of response to last week. So last week was all about the sovereignty of God, the bigness of who God is. This week is a little bit of what is our response in his sermon titled Made to Worship. Couple things before we get started here. One is I do want to recommend a book. If you are interested in any of this kind of theological education, this is my favorite book for people to get started with. It's called Faith Seeking Understanding by Daniel Migliore. It is phenomenal. I've walked through it with a couple of individuals in the past. But it does not assume any language, and yet it really brings you into the theological conversations in a great way. So definitely, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, grab that book, Faith Seeking Understanding by Daniel Migliore, and then let me know you got it, because I would be very excited to talk to you about that. Also, no one who's in the studio today has nice handwriting, just like last week, so sorry, this is the best I got. But today we're talking about a little bit of the doctrine of man, and that is an outdated term. It should be called, I guess, the doctrine of people or the doctrine of humankind, but it just doesn't roll off the tongue as well. It doesn't sound as good as doctrine of man, so we're just going to leave that there for today. But essentially what we're doing is saying, when we consider humankind in relation to faith and in relation to theology, in relation to the sovereign God we learned about last week, what can we say about mankind? So there's a couple things. I mentioned last week that there's some theologies that are really hard to talk about or give language to. And there's also some that it's almost easier to say what they're not than what they are. That'll kind of play into this. So when we look at this doctrine of man, who are we? There's kind of two main categories that we don't want to fall into. The first is called angelism, right? Where we see the word angel. And that is the idea that we are just spirits. We're just our spiritual selves that is, temporarily parked in a physical body, right? It's that really all we are is a spirit stuck, trapped in this physical body, waiting until we die to get released. Now that sounds kind of extreme, but actually this is a very, very prevalent philosophy, starting with Plato, called Gnosticism. Is the idea that everything that is spiritual is better than everything that is physical. Now this actually plagued the church early on. It turned into what's called Docetism, which means to seem, S-E-E-M, because they believed that there's no way that Jesus, God, could have been in the flesh, because flesh is sinful, flesh is bad, right? So they said it just seemed like he was here, but if you threw a rock at Jesus, it would have gone right through him. He was like a spirit, he was like a ghost. Now, once again, that sounds extreme. We don't deal with that the way the New Testament church did. But that idea of fleshly being bad is still very prevalent. Even Christians' inhibitions of talking about things like sex or stuff like that is a piece of that. It's just that what is physical and fleshly is bad. What's spiritual and mystical, that's what's good. So that is called angelism, and that is something that we want to get away from. Now, on the other side of it is what's called naturalism. That's the idea that all I am is flesh and blood. All I am is a body. There is no spirit in me, and there's no spirit in anyone, and there's no God. It's just this natural world, which, of course, if you're watching a church video right now, I'm guessing is probably not your viewpoint. So when we talk about the doctrine of man, we talk about theology regarding human beings, it's somewhere in the middle of these two. Now, what does that sound like to you when we talk about balancing the body and the spirit, living somehow with both body and spirit? If that rings a bell, it sounds like Jesus, right? The Catholic Church, in trying to identify him, finally came down to the statement that he is both fully man and fully God. I don't know how you fit 200% into one body, but he's doing it some way. But when you understand that we as well are not just a body, and we're not just a spirit, we are an embodied spirit. We're not just temporarily parking in these bodies. We are these bodies, and we have a spirit as well. When we balance these two, we realize just how much more Jesus really is put forth as the model of humanity. Now, he is God, and we are not God, but as we seek to live both our spiritual Christian life, and yet at the same time we're in these bodies, we can look at this example of Jesus, who was God and yet dwelt in a body and dealt with hunger and all these human fleshly things that we deal with. He dealt with them too. So with fighting the temptation of going to either one and knowing that we are somehow in the middle, perfectly both, we see Christ as our example. The other thing I want to give you is what's, I'm writing here, created to image. It comes from Genesis, when at the creation story, God says, let us make man in our own image, right? Now, those English translations are a pretty poor example. It's actually much more in the Hebrew grammar, it's much more of an active word. Let me give you this interpretation, this takeaway of that passage from Daniel Migliori's book. He says, the image of God is not like an image permanently stamped on a coin. It is more like an image reflected in a mirror. That is, human beings are created for life in relationships that mirror or correspond to God's own life in relationship. It's fascinating. It's when we say that we're creating God's image, it's not like a photograph or like a stamped coin where it's stagnant and it stays. It's dynamic, it changes, much like a mirror. It mirrors you, it images you, and as you raise your arms, it goes up too. It is continuously mirroring you. In the same way, we were created, human beings were created to image God. Doesn't just mean that we were somehow physically created to resemble his body. There's nothing to do with what our body looks like or anything like that. It's that we were created to be the one being on this earth that is constantly attempting to live in reflection to the truth of who God is. And in the same way, we see that glimpse of that Trinitarian language at the beginning. Let us create man in our image. He's in relation, the Trinity says that God is in relationship with himself. Father, Son, Holy Spirit are somehow in relationship with himself, which is interesting and confusing and weird. But it gives us this example that we were created to live in relationship, not just with God, but also with others. In the same way that the Trinity models for us relationship, we seek to live in relationship with others. But I want to give you that idea. It's a powerful one, that what we're called to do is constantly be imaging God and his nature. Now, there's a word in theology called revelation, and it's the idea that God is revealing himself, revealing actively who he is. And the greatest revelation that God has ever given to mankind is himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ. So as we study the gospel, it's like we're doing in this series, we are getting the greatest revelation of who God is. And as we get that revelation, we know that it is our call. We were created to image it, to reflect it back in our life, in our relationships, and in everyone around us. And as we do that, that brings us back to our sermon today of Made to Worship. Nothing is more glorifying to God than living up to our created call. That when he looks at us as individuals and as communities, as churches, and he sees that we are modeling our lives and imaging him in his relationship, that is worship. Just like the greatest gift the kids could ever give to the parents is getting along, right? He looks at us, and the greatest worship we could ever do of him is that we live up to this call of being created to image him actively in our lives and in our relationships. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.